Hey, what is up? Welcome to this episode of the Entrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast. As always, I'm your host, Brian Lofermento, and I am so excited about today's episode and the conversation that I get to have with an incredible guest, because today's guest is one of us. Claire is a fellow entrepreneur that I'm so excited for you to all meet, because when we talk about the impact that AI and technology and software and SaaS companies and the impacts that all of these things are having on literally every industry and every market, well, today's guest, Claire, is at the center of so much of that, enabling others to use technology in really meaningful ways. So let me introduce you to Claire. Claire Knutson is the founder of Bold Minds and the creator of Traverzer, which is a tool for software engineers built to simplify the hardest parts of working with evolving data models. With a background in software development and a mission to reduce cognitive load for engineers, Claire is rethinking how teams build systems from prototypes to production with resilience and joy. And this is important for all of us because software is the next frontier. Obviously, it's been an existing frontier, but there's so many incredible opportunities if you can start to make sense of this stuff. And Claire does so much of that. So I'm very excited about this conversation. I'm not going to say anything else. Let's dive straight into my interview with Claire Knutson. All right, Claire, I am so very excited that you're here with us today. First things first, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brian, for having me.
Heck yes, I'm excited because I just feel like we're at this really interesting time in mankind and in society and technology where nobody knows what the future holds. Things are changing very quickly. So before we start talking about those trends, Claire, take us beyond the bio. Who's Claire? How did you start doing all these cool things?
I've been doing software engineering for a long time, over 20 years now. I knew what I wanted to do, and I remember the moment it hit me that I knew I wanted to be a software engineer. It's like freshman in high school, took a computer course, and it was the cutest thing where you're creating these little landscapes and moving stuff around. And I was like, I could get paid for this? And I was like, that's amazing. I'm just going to do that. And so what it ended up being that way, that, graduated high school, took a little bit of a gap year or two, but, went and got my degree and then jumped right on into an internship and, a career that has been strictly software engineering, and that's included working in government and consulting and being a regular old employee, and now I am moving on into the next chapter of my life. I hate to be so dramatic, but it really is. It's going to be a huge change moving into this, and the change is definitely sort of an all in now. I actually just left my full-time day job a few days ago, just this past Friday.
Claire, that means you are fresh on. You are not just a fellow entrepreneur. You are a full-time entrepreneur. That is cause for a lot of celebrations. I'm so excited about that, and it leads me that's probably the easiest segue I've ever had on air, is introduce us to Bold Minds. Obviously, you've built incredible things behind the scenes. I'd love for you to share that with listeners.
Yeah. So Bold Minds, the name really, to me, speaks for itself in a way, but just to go further with it is that, so to me, Bold Minds is about challenging the status quo in tech, about the things that we think must be a certain way. We must develop a certain way. It needs to look a certain way because that's the way it's been done. And so, I like to experiment and challenge those things and see and dream and see if those dreams can become a reality. And so that's the reason behind this whole name, and really the product that is coming out in public beta very soon, Traverzer. It actually wasn't the first idea. It was actually a much smaller piece of a much, much bigger picture.
Yeah, it's really cool thinking about all the different possibilities that open up thanks to technology, but I'm going to interject this into the conversation, Claire, because I'm a big fan of words, and I always pay attention to the way people articulate things, and I love this language that I saw about Bold Minds, about what your company does. And you had written, when tools get out of the way, teams ship faster, onboard members quicker, and build more software, not tech debt. I want you to talk to us about that, because it just seems to me, and obviously as the host of this show, I interview entrepreneurs and business leaders from all different industries. Speed matters, Claire, and it seems like that's such a core part of your mission as well.
It absolutely is. It's very easy as an engineer, because you love, solving problems and the complexity of problems and getting into the details, that you design for details. You design, in a way that makes it, in some ways, just fun for you. But that that doesn't help you take a step back and look at the bigger picture and say, how can we go faster? How can we increase our velocity? And I honestly believe that, a little bit of it is letting go of some of the things that, maybe engineers don't need to worry about. It's fun to think about, but maybe we don't need to worry about them. Maybe we can let go of some of the processes that we do today and really just stay in that flow. And I love to use the word, as the last word in the bio, joy. I really personally believe that even tools that are strictly for engineers, for them to do their job better, can be joyful to them.
Yeah, it's such an important call out. And I think that all of us, whether a listener is in the tech space such as yourself or not, even if we're working with tech co-founders, for example, or we're working with tools and submitting bug requests, which, Claire, we all have to tend to do with so many of the different tools that we work with, it's important to understand the real human elements behind it. It's fun to have this conversation with you on the air, because someone who's in such a deep part of the tech sector, we're talking about joy and resilience. Claire, where does that factor in? You talk about removing some of the pain points for engineers. What are some examples of those things in the business world, so that we as business leaders and we as tool users, so that we can all understand those?
Yeah, I do think that, Traverzer is definitely a great tool to talk about that helps provide some really solid examples of what can we eliminate. And so with Traverzer, part of what is being eliminated is the very manual processes that exist today about, writing these explicit instructions about exactly what's the shape of your data, how much data is there going to be, and making sure that things, relate logically to each other, that making sure everybody agrees and understands. And, with having a lot of process, and when it takes a lot of time to do, there's not a lot of, flexibility, and there's not a lot of change that can happen rapidly. And so, some of the things, right, in terms of efficiency is like, okay, well, we got everybody together. They all agreed. Here's the design. Now we have to write all the scripts, and now we have to test all the scripts, and now we have to deploy and hope everything kind of goes well there. And then as, this living and breathing, data store that you now have, it's going to need to evolve over time. And, one of the very common things to do, but very risky things as well, has to do with when your data needs to change a little bit, when maybe the definition of the data, right, what you call it in terms of the business domain, so that way it matches and everybody talks the same language. Trying to change these names in your database, as your product is being used, there's a lot of risk there to make sure you don't have this downtime. And there's plenty of times that I've seen where everything is planned well and practiced and tested, but your lower environments, your development environment, your testing area, they just don't accurately represent what's going on in your true live production world. And then things can very easily go wrong. And so taking out a lot of these processes and really just saying, hey, you know what, these processes about setting up the data and making sure it gets put in there right and being able to change it, like, those are really just standard. They're out of the box. You don't even know about them. In Traverzer, you don't see how any of that happens. It's just you almost kind of like you kind of just throw your data in and it's just managed.
Yeah, which of course is everybody's dream. Well, I'll be honest, Claire, while you and I are talking here on the air, where my head goes is how many doors open up for creative solutions and SaaS products for people who this stuff traditionally held them back. And it sounds like your work is committed to reopening those doors. And a big part of me wants to ask you, how's AI playing into all of this? Because I would imagine that it's a huge help. When we talk about opening doors, it's making it more accessible for other people. Of course, with some considerations, you have the technical know-how to back it up and use AI in the right way, but give us that macro view. How's AI shaping the landscape that you're operating in?
Yeah, well, I will say that it's kind of two different buckets in my mind. There's the bucket where it's in like the product itself, like, Traverzer, would it ever have AI? Is that something on the roadmap? And right now, I can say confidently that I would not put AI in Traverzer, or I'm actually kind of, crossing my fingers in a way that, I don't ever need to take on that complexity of integrating AI into, the products that I'm building. I would much rather focus, my products and, what's being delivered to be simple enough that you don't need AI to make it simpler. I mean, so that's, one area. But then there's, to me, sort of the other side of this is that, in terms of like, using AI myself for, writing my code or, for writing promotional materials, or helping with ideas, get the juices flowing, or vetting my ideas and saying, hey, I have this idea and gosh, it sounds really good, but tell me what I'm missing. I mean, so being able to have, being able to bounce those ideas off of, at least something else is great. And I think one of the conclusions I've really come to, at least of course for the moment, it's ever shifting though, is that in the last 2 months, I've been working a lot on a daily with AI. And, it's humans who created AI. So there's, in some ways, how are we going to create something that's beyond ourselves? We don't know what's beyond ourselves. So how do you create something that is beyond that? And so when I use AI, it still has a lot of these human-like qualities. It goes faster. Don't get me wrong. It has a lot of benefits. It reads faster, writes faster, summarizes, and just like humans, it tends to make mistakes. It forgets things, all of that stuff. And so there's definitely been somewhat of a learning curve in a sense about, gosh, how do I communicate with this in a way where I get the results that I want? And honestly, I find it just a little bit funny. Not sure if the word ironic, plays in here, but that AI is talked about like, oh, it makes everything faster, it makes everything easier, so on and so forth. But it relies on communication. And I can't say I've ever heard somebody say that humans are great communicators.
It's true. That's absolutely true. And again, we come back to these human considerations, Claire, but one word that I feel like it keeps coming up in all of your answers is simplicity. And it's so clear. And I'm going to call out for listeners that simplicity features not only in the language that you're using here on the air, but it shows up very much throughout your website, through everything that Bold Minds puts into the world. And it reminds me, I use this quote so often on air, Claire. It's an Albert Einstein quote where he said, if you want to impress somebody, make it complicated. If you want to help somebody, make it simple. And I always think about how much in our lives, I think about in school, and we all had to give those last minute presentations. We want it to sound like we read the book, or we want to make it sound like we watched that movie. And so we do err more towards the side of making things complicated to seemingly show competency when it's actually the opposite that achieves that. And so I want to talk about whether it's you building Traverzer or whether it's past projects that you've worked on. What does Claire's filter look like when you think about and fight that human urge of, well, let's also build this on, and let's also build this on, and let's make it do this? How do you filter out that stuff that keeps it simple and keeps it clean and focuses on what really matters?
Yeah, I feel like that there's kind of two things. One is that I always, and this is kind of where Traverzer came from as well, about, gosh, I was building a bigger product, I was working on this, working on a very big product, and then I needed a very flexible database, and then I was going to need to write all these scripts and all the process I was talking about. And then I was like, gosh, but what if I didn't have to? What would that look like? So that's definitely one piece of the puzzle. The other piece that I kind of always reference back to in my mind, or an analogy here, is the whole, people, funny enough, they don't want to buy drills from the hardware store. They actually, what they want at the end of the day is a hole in the wall. They could have a hole in the wall without buying a drill. They do it, but they're not going to get what they need in terms of the accuracy and the right size and all of this without a drill. I mean, so really focusing on what's truly the end result that we want, not all the ththings that we could do to get there. And so like with Traverzer, I mean, a lot of people could say, oh, we want something super fast, or, and I don't know if I have other good ones right now, but at the end of the day, it's really a database, regardless of which one, and type, and size. It's, I have some data, I need to store that data, and I need to retrieve that data later. And if you can accomplish that, like just those things, that's what you needed to do. I mean, all the other stuff is but gosh, it may be fun for some folks, but I will say for me, it's not my joy to get into those details. And I personally have so many ideas for apps. I want to move faster. And that's where a lot of this comes from, is that I, as an engineer, and even though I can do this stuff, I feel so slowed down by all the work that is required today. And I do love building tools for other engineers, and so much of the time, though, they are really something that I want to leverage.
Yeah, I love that perspective, especially because, Claire, I'll publicly out myself for a second, is that over the weekend, I'm always curious about learning new things. And one thing that I feel like I've tapped into, whether it's just using Zapier or any other tool online, is APIs, basic APIs. And it finally hit me this week, and I was like, I don't know what an API is. I don't know how it actually works. So I hopped on YouTube and watched like a, APIs 101 video. And that's essentially what the person said was, yeah, the entire web is a series of data sitting there, getting it and serving it to you, the user. Even if you click on YouTube, there's a database of all the videos. When I click it, YouTube knows how to serve it to me. And so hearing you simplify these things, it's really meaningful for us to understand. And I think it puts a new lens for all of us in our own businesses, because the principles you and I are talking about, they transcend just development and programming. This is life. This is business as a whole, which, Claire, makes me ask you a bit of a more philosophical question, because the more that I was reading through what Bold Minds does, it's these 3 words that keep jumping out at me. Reduce cognitive load. It's something that I always share with my team in our internal Slack channels, is I just want to get these ideas out of my head and get them onto paper so I don't have to carry them around. And obviously that touches on, and here's the philosophical part, it touches just on the mere concept of mindfulness, is that if our mind is full of a bunch of other things, there's not much room for the bigger things. And I think that's such an important thing. How much of life do you bring into the way that you operate your business? Because it just seems to me like you think in creative solutions and simple solutions, and I would imagine that flows through to your business.
Oh, it absolutely does. I will say in the last year, I've been going through actually a whole bunch of personal development trainings, in-person live trainings, and it has really changed my outlook on life. And I start to see how, like you're saying, life's lessons transcend, and that the part about cognitive load. So the more that I let go, the more I can actually take in. I keep struggling to kind of put some words together here, and actually it's because you're talking about philosophical lessons and all of this stuff. And so if it's okay, I'd like to talk about something that's maybe a little tangential here.
Claire, absolutely. Hey, the name of the game here on our podcast is learning from all the different corners of life and business, and I think there's a lot of value there.
Yeah, thank you. So in these personal development trainings, one of the things that we end up doing is talking about and seeing if we can visualize our life's purpose. And for me, I think I already kind of came into it with a pretty good sense of what that is. But going through the training and visualizing it really solidified that I knew. And, I will say and they have us boil these life purposes down into about the smallest, phrase you could possibly get away with and have it understandable. And mine is raising the tide of mental health. And that, for me, that drives everything that I do. It really is a part of back to the cognitive load, about joy. It may not seem like maybe mental health and developing tools for engineers, would be so directly related. But, anytime I feel like that we improve, the work that somebody is doing, help them, enjoy their work more, have it be easier, that raises their mental health. And in the really big picture of things, my personal belief is that, there's so many large scale problems in the world. And there's, a lot of things that we can do, to help those. But when I think about mental health, and especially saying raising the tide, right? Raising, everybody's mental health, is that if we, societally raised mental health, I feel like you'd have more people working towards making a better world instead of a few people really investing. So it's kind of that base layer of when everybody's mental health improves, they start helping others.
Boom, Claire, you know what? I want to very publicly praise you and pile on to this because to me, it's deeply meaningful. Actually, I'm getting goosebumps hearing you talk about this because when I ask you about how much of your life filters into the work that you do, I love that this is where you went because the two are intertwined and they always will be. And I think that when we find that much deeper meaning, it's important. And that's why I'll tell you straight up, the reason why this resonates so deeply with me is the founding principle. If I had to boil down this entire show to one founding principle, it's a rising tide lifts all boats. And so it doesn't go past me that's the type of verbiage that you use right there. And I think it's important because all of us as entrepreneurs, Claire, entrepreneurship is hard for you. It's hard for me. It's hard for every single listener. And I think that these are the important conversations that we have to have. And I think that I really want to emphasize it's not a tangent. This is intertwined. And so for listeners who tune into a business podcast thinking, why would we talk about mental health? It's because it's a thing and we all have to face this. So I'm so appreciative of you going there with us here on the air. And with that in mind, I think it's so cool how it ties in with your mission and something that people might not see on the surface. That's your why, and that's what drives you forward. So, Claire, I appreciate that. Also has very personal, deep meaning for me as well. And along those lines, this last question, you've been such a wealth of knowledge. I don't know how you're going to top all of that for this last question, because I always ask the question of, what's your biggest piece of advice for listeners? And we talk about this question not in the context of our conversation, but as entrepreneurs, with our entrepreneurial hats on. And Claire, I'm really excited to see where you go, knowing that we're being listened to by both entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs at all different stages of their own growth journeys, and knowing that you are a full-time entrepreneur yourself. What's that number one piece of advice that you want to leave listeners with?
Oh, yeah, the thing that comes to my mind and has been on my mind a lot in the last 6 months is investigating what you do to self-sabotage. And another way to think about it is subconsciously, what are you more committed to than, your entrepreneurship, your business? So for example, for myself, it's that, I am more committed to looking smart than to getting a product out the door. And so I invite everybody, to really look at your own feelings and behaviors and see, are you holding yourself back?
Boom. Claire, at so many times in my own entrepreneurial journey, that advice would have been the answer and the advice that I needed. So I'm very appreciative that you are offering those words of wisdom and advice to our listeners around the world, because that's the stuff that matters. And the cool thing about it, and the cool thing about so much of life and business is it's personal. We have to look inward to find those answers, Claire. And it just seems to me, here you are so early on in your full-time entrepreneurial career that you're doing the stuff that matters, which of course, whether we talk about your business, whether we talk about your entrepreneurial journey, that's what you've mastered. And I'm so excited to watch your journey from here. And especially for listeners who want to check out Bold Minds and all the cool work that you're doing. Obviously, you're a builder, and I love even how you built your website, how you articulate all of the things, the messaging, the copy behind all of it reveals so much of your mindset and your attitude that I'm so appreciative for. So drop those links on us, Claire. Where should listeners go from here?
They should go to boldminds.tech for the company, and Traverzer.tech, which is TraverserTech. verzer.tech for the upcoming product.
Yes, and listeners, you already know the drill. We're making it as easy as possible for you to find those links down below in the show notes, no matter where it is that you're tuning into today's episode. So if you're on the go, you're driving, or you think to yourself, Claire, I can't remember how to spell my last name sometimes, let alone a URL, no worries. You can find those links down below in the show notes. Otherwise, Claire, on behalf of myself and all the listeners worldwide, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.